Alex, John, can you hear me, and see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
I can, yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. So I hope to finish World War II today, but chances are I won't. And if I get close, we will finish it up on Tuesday. And following that, we will have a review session that the TAs will participate in, and I might participate in it to a certain extent for a little bit also. So today, there's a lot of things to talk about. And I want to start out by sort of seeing if we can set a mood for what was going on in the United States, because we talked about Pearl Harbor. I talked about bringing the American soldiers into North Africa. And I think when I finished, we were talking about what was going on with Germany, with the Holocaust and that sort of thing. But I want to set the tone for what was going on in America also, that is back here at home. I think we can certainly argue that American society was very upset with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There was a feeling for need for revenge against the Japanese, or maybe against Asians. I want to talk a little bit about that here in the beginning. It's a phrase that was referred to as yellow peril. Terrible word, very, very pejorative to call Asian people yellow. But I'm going to talk about it, and I think you'll be able to put it into some context. And what's weird about it is even as the war goes on, there is more of a feeling of revenge and hatred for Japan than there is for Germany. And that's one of those things that sociologists and psychologists try to deal with, is why is it that we see more aggression towards Japan and Japanese people than we do towards Germans and German people, when we know that there are things going on in Germany that are really crimes against humanity in terms of the Holocaust. And most people will come back to the fact that, well, it's because they bombed Pearl Harbor. But it's got to go deeper than that, because I talked about 1882 a couple of weeks ago about the Chinese exclusion law and how we wanted to get rid of Chinese. We didn't want to admit Chinese. We actually passed laws against admitting Chinese, about Chinese staying here and all those things. And now we get bombed by the Japanese. On the other hand, the Japanese and the Chinese are at war with each other. So we embrace the Chinese to be part of us as our ally. And at the same time, we have this Chinese exclusion law sitting out there. But the Chinese exclusion law, we're going to amend that law with the Magnuson Act in 1943, saying there is no longer a Chinese exclusion law because you, China, are now our ally. However, we also do something that is one of the most horrendous things that has ever happened in American history. And as I told you at the beginning, I don't try to sugarcoat US history. If it's a good thing, I'm going to talk about it. If it's a bad thing, I'm going to talk about it. But we, in the United States, we will pass a law by Franklin Roosevelt. It will actually go to the US Congress to become a bill, and it will get supported by the United States Supreme Court. And that is that we decide to put up concentration camps in America, in places like Arizona, in order to incarcerate United States citizens of Japanese descent. Yes, we incarcerated American citizens of Japanese descent. And the best way for me to explain this is by explaining it through the story of a good friend of mine. He died a few years ago. He was my father's golf partner in Arkansas, and I used to play golf with him. His name was Sam Rokitani. You don't need to remember his name, but I want you to remember the story because it applies completely to what I'm talking about here. And I want you to imagine what it would have been like to be Sam, who was about 22 years old, I believe, and was living in California. And had graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, was actually on their baseball team, was a pitcher on their baseball team, and had actually been, taken them to the equivalent of what we now call the College World Series. Sam was Japanese, but he was third generation, meaning his great grandfather had been the one that had immigrated to the United States. Not his dad, not even his grandfather. It was his great grandfather that had come to America way back in the 1850s. Maybe one of those guys that was even involved in the building of the railroad. Many of those were Chinese, but they were also Japanese. So Sam is running an auto supply store in down near San Diego, as I recall. And Pearl Harbor is bombed. And just a few months later, in March of 1941, we passed this law saying that Japanese people of Japanese descent are going to be taken to concentration camps. So Sam's entire family, his mom, his brothers, his sisters, everybody are hauled off to someplace in Arizona to a concentration camp with wires being guarded to make sure they don't leave. The United States Army came into the camp and they said to people like Sam that were young, that were looked to be of an age that they could be in the military. They said to Sam and some of his friends, hey, you Japanese guys, if you're willing to become interpreters for America's war against the Japanese, we will let you out of the camps. We're not going to let your families out of the camps, but we will let you out of the camp, out of the concentration camps. And here's what we want you to do. We want you to be available to interrogate and interpret for interrogators of Japanese prisoners of war when we start our island hopping across the Pacific. And Sam says, well, I'd sure like to get out of this camp. I'd love to do this. There's only one problem. I don't speak Japanese. Well, they said, how can you not speak Japanese? You're Japanese. He says, I've never even been to Japan. I'm third generation. And they said, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. We will send you to the University of Minnesota to learn the Japanese language. I'm not quite sure why Minnesota. But anyway, Sam is hauled off to the University of Minnesota to learn the Japanese language so that he can become an interpreter for the United States Army as it island hops across the Pacific. Well, Sam learned to speak Japanese. But what he found out was that in the Army and in the Navy and in the Marines and all of the units that are going to be island hopping to Japan, they turn you into an infantry soldier to fight your way onto the island before you have a chance to do any interpreting. So Sam was essentially an infantry rifleman until the island was taken, at which time he became the interpreter or interrogator. And he happened to work for someone who was very much a gung-ho colonel who decided that he was going to use Sam as a soldier before he was going to use him as an interpreter. And so Sam was involved in the operations into Kwajalein, into Guam. All these islands were Sam's infantry battlefield before he had the opportunity to become an interpreter and interrogator. And in the meantime, Sam, unlike most other men in the military, Sam had to worry not only about the battle he was in, but he had to worry about his family back home in Arizona that had been placed in a concentration camp, even though they were American citizens. Now, this happened all over America, mostly California, because that's where most Japanese live. But part of the problem was that everybody that looked like they were Asian, whether they happened to be Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian, Vietnamese, whatever they happened to be, they were considered to be Japanese because they looked like Japanese. And that's one of those, terrible things. And I'll tell you how bad this was, is that it was realized after the war was over that America had made a huge mistake in incarcerating our own citizens. And for almost every presidency after FDR, almost every presidency that went all the way up through President Reagan, there was always a movement to pay reparations to these Japanese American citizens. And finally, they were paid, I believe, $25,000 each or something, the ones that were still alive. And that didn't happen till well into, I think it was actually the Reagan administration, about 30 years later. But it's one of those moments when we say, gee, how can this happen? How does somebody decide that a Japanese an American citizen has a closer feeling towards his ancestors than he does his own citizenship? Now, we didn't incarcerate Japanese American citizens in Hawaii. And that's an interesting thing to me because, quite frankly, there are so many people of Oriental descent, of Japanese, Chinese descent in Hawaii. The decision was made to not incarcerate anyone in Hawaii, but we did in America, in the continental United States. Anyway, I wanted you to know that story about my friend Sam because it tells you everything you need to know about the feeling that Americans had toward the Japanese of wanting this revenge. And that's going to come into play again later on when we talk about how to end this war. So that's my story about the Japanese American soldiers. You can write this first word down. It's called Nisei, N-I-S-E-I. Nisei warriors. And these were essentially Japanese Americans who fought for America because they were American citizens. We actually set up units of Japanese Americans, and they distinguished themselves in battle. But my friend was as a good example of that. So that's my story of the Japanese Americans. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about two other minorities at this time, if you can make that argument. First of all, let me talk a little bit about women. There were 250,000 American women who served in the military during World War II. They served in organizations such as the WACS, which is the Women's Army Corps, the Army Nurses Corps, Navy nurses, but most women during this time did not serve in the military. 250,000 sounds like a lot, but most women served in American industries. In American industries, making planes, tanks, weapons. They took the jobs that would normally have been jobs that would have been filled by American men, so that the men could go off to fight. You've seen the posters of Rosie the Riveter, which is a very famous poster, because American women served very well. Now, I'm going to talk next week. I'll be talking about what happens after the war to the women who become such great industrial workers when the men come home, and how women are taken out of the workplace when they come home. But anyway, I wanted you to hear that story of the women. And then the other ones that I want to talk about are African Americans. Very sadly, after World War I, a lot of African-American soldiers that had served in the military were accused of cowardice in a couple of operations that later on turned out to be, they were erroneously blamed for cowardice when they ran from what turned out to be friendly fire. We also know that during the 1920s, 1930s, and the pre-war period, the Jim Crow laws were so bad that African Americans were considered to be less than American citizens. We have the lynchings that I talked about the other day. Lots of bad things going on. And yet we will draft African American soldiers into the military. However, we will not allow African American soldiers to serve in integrated units. African American soldiers are serving in only Black units. And if they serve in Black units, they will not be in combat. Now, when I talk about that, what I'm really talking about is the fact that African Americans, when I say they're in a unit, they're in an all-white unit, but they're going to be in pieces within that unit, like in a big division, that are not combat oriented. We do not allow African American soldiers to be combat soldiers. Why is that? Well, one of the fears was if you train African American soldiers to use weapons, they might come home from this war and use those weapons against white people down south. As silly as that, you can imagine that being, that was the attitude towards African Americans. They were not allowed to serve in combat. However, there were a couple of exceptions, and one of those exceptions is something that you may have heard about, and that is what we call the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African Americans who were trained to fly aircraft. And there was a big controversy about this. One of the American leaders wrote, "Negro pilots can't be used in the Air Corps units because this would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men, creating an impossible social situation." Because pilots, generally speaking, pilots in World War II were officers. But the men that worked on the planes and the crews, the machine gunners and the bombardiers and the mechanics that helped load the planes and helped keep them flying were enlisted men. So if you had an African American pilot, he would be supervising white people. And that was absolutely unheard of, that a Black person could supervise a white person in 1943. So we set up this organization out of Tuskegee, Alabama, called the Tuskegee Airmen. I won't give you the military terms. That's enough for you to know that they were Tuskegee Airmen. And they were trained to be bombardiers, bomber pilots, but mostly they were trained to be fighter pilots that would escort the bombers over Germany and keep those bombers from getting shot down because of the efficiency of those Black pilots. So what do we know about the results of this? Well, they flew 15,000 combat sorties. 15,000, that's a mission. 15,000 sorties, destroyed 112 German aircraft. And in their protection, they only had something like 7 bombers ever shot down. In other words, they did a good job. They did a hell of a good job. And yet, none of those men were ever awarded the kinds of awards that you would think they would be awarded for their combat efficiency, for the great things that they did. Later on, way back, I think actually during the Obama administration, the unit, the Tuskegee Airmen, were actually given recognition as a unit, but individual soldiers not necessarily so. So they did a very, very good job, and we should give them great credit for that effort. I want to mention one other one other sailor that you may have heard of, if you watched that terrible movie I told you about on Tuesday called Pearl Harbor, you saw a character played by Cuba Gooding by the name of Dory Miller, who happened to be at the time of Pearl Harbor, he was actually an admiral's butler, you might call him, aide, butler's, an admiral's aide. He was the guy that helped the admiral make sure that he had his clothes pressed and took care of his food and all this stuff on a ship called the West Virginia, which was one of the ships that was in the battle at Pearl Harbor. And as the ship was being attacked, his admiral was killed. And his name is Dory Miller, D-O-R-I-E Miller. And in the movie, you will see him pick up a 50 caliber machine gun and start shooting down Japanese aircraft. And that is a very true story. He was actually awarded the Navy Cross, which is the second highest honor that you can earn other than the Medal of Honor. And they actually named a frigate after him, a small ship after him, way back in the 1970s. But bottom line is, it wasn't until recently they actually have named a new aircraft carrier, the USS Dory Miller, and it will be laid down in 2023, I believe, and see service in 2028. So that's a big deal to have a ship named after you, and in this case, to be named after a sailor. So those are just some stories that I wanted you to understand, that we're not just talking about big things that are happening. We're talking about small things that are happening in addition to that. Okay? Let's move on. So we're going to talk about D-Day today. And the other day, I talked about the fact that George Patton was considered to be the best leader that America had. But he'd gotten in trouble when he slapped this soldier down in Sicily. And in the process of doing that, General Eisenhower decided we had to be careful what we did with George Patton, because he might get in trouble again. He might do something stupid again. However, the enemy, Germany, thought that George Patton was the best. And they believed that if their intelligence and spying showed them that George Patton, wherever George Patton was, all they had to do was follow him around, and they would know where America was going to invade the continent of Europe. So let me give you a picture of France. So here's England, and the Allies, Britain, Canada, and the United States, will all start practicing, training in England for an invasion of Europe. And there are lots of places that we might invade. Now, y'all know, spoiler alert, we're going to invade at Normandy. And I'm going to talk about that, of course, today. And here's Normandy right here. But here's a place called Calais. And Calais is actually, if you look, it's actually closer to Dover, England, which is where most of the training is going on. So the United States, knowing that Germany is flying overhead with their Luftwaffe, the United States sets up this operation called Operation Fortitude. And it's going to be led by General George Patton. So let me tell you a little bit about this operation. See this picture of this nice American tank? That's a beautiful tank, isn't it? Yeah, here's 4 guys lifting that tank on their shoulders. How can that happen? That tank is made out of rubber. It's a fake tank. And the idea is that if the Luftwaffe German aircraft are flying overhead and they look down and see this tank, and they know that George Patton's somewhere in the neighborhood, then the chances are pretty strong that that's where America is going to invade, and the invasion is and all the written information is we're going to invade at Calais, which is the closest crossing of the English Channel into into France. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about now. If I were in front of you in the classroom, I would ask this question, and I would ask for the hands, and I can't do that with the Zoom, but you'll see that I'm wearing my 82nd Airborne. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I'm wearing my 82nd Airborne Division shirt today, a shirt that I actually bought at Saint-Mary-Église, where I'll talk about here in a minute. My point is that I would ask this question of all of you: how many of you ever jumped out of an airplane? And a bunch of you would raise your hand because you've done sport jumps and stuff. Sometimes I have soldiers, or I have veterans in my class that are actually in the 82nd Airborne Division or the 101st Airborne Division that have actually been an airborne trooper, as I was. Not in World War II, obviously. But I would ask the question, I would say, how many of you ever jumped out of an airplane? And hands would go up. And then I would say, however, how many of you have ever jumped out of an airplane at night? And my hand would go up. I have jumped out of an airplane at night. Most people have not jumped out of an airplane at night. And then I would ask the question, how many have ever jumped out of an airplane at night into combat? And nobody would raise their hand, I don't believe. Even me. I have never jumped out of an airplane at night into combat. That's what I'm going to be talking about now. Imagine jumping out of an airplane at night into combat behind enemy lines. That's what the American 82nd Airborne Division and 101st Airborne Division and some British soldiers did at a place called Normandy. Now, there's a lot of controversy over the efficiency of sending troops into a battlefield by air, because it's a very inefficient thing to do. You have an element of surprise is about all you have, because even today, we don't do it very often. The element of surprise is important, but here is a map of Normandy. Let me see if I can make it just a little bit bigger. Let's see if I can. Yeah, okay. So here is a map of Normandy. We're not going to come into Calais. We're going to come into this place called Normandy, which is a much further distance from England across the English Channel. At 2 o'clock in the morning on December 7th, 1944, British, US, and Canadian troops are going to eventually come ashore. But before that happens, before all these ships with men, Marines, Army, come ashore, we're going to send in the 101st Airborne and the 82nd, and they're going to jump behind these enemy lines with the idea that it will be an element of surprise that will cause all of these soldiers that are lined up at Normandy, not as many as are over at Calais, where they think it's going to happen, but it will cause them to have to turn and fight against American and Allied soldiers behind enemy lines. Well, when they jump out of these airplanes, it's a mess. A lot of the airplanes are shot up, and the soldiers are left to drop into the sea. They miss their drop zones. When they land, they can't find their units. It is a total mess, which happens in a lot of airborne operations. However, and let me show you one of the messes here. This is a guy here. I'll get this a little bit smaller so you can see it. This guy's name is John Steele. Now, this isn't a real picture of him hanging there. This is actually a monument on a church in a place called Saint-Mary-Église, which is just behind the beaches at Normandy, in which case John Steele jumped and got hung up on this church and hung there for about 7 hours before he was captured and held prisoner. But it's kind of a cute story in that the French, even today, honor John Steele by having a monument at that church that shows that he hung there for about 8 hours after having jumped into behind enemy lines. And so the point here is that this was a total mess, And by that, I mean nobody, no American, no British, no Canadian soldier knew where the hell they were. And yet it was effective as hell because the Germans had to turn and fight and they didn't know where the hell anyone was. And by doing that, they turned the wrong direction, and that allowed the invasion on the beaches to take place. Now, I will be sending you a link this weekend that I want you to watch, which is the invasion at D-Day as filmed in the movie Saving Private Ryan. I'm going to give you a link that's about 10 minutes long, and it's pretty accurate. I know it's accurate because when Spielberg and the boys made that movie, they decided that in the making of that movie, they would be as efficient as they could, and they actually had D-Day veterans view the film, and the veterans said they got it right. The only thing that's missing from that film when you watch it, and I will give you an alert that it's hard to watch, but in that, what they said was that the only thing that was missing was the smell of death, the smell of flesh burning, the smell of blood, lots of it. Other than that, they said that they got it right. It's an amazing film. If you haven't seen it, I want you to just watch. I'm just going to give you a 10-minute link because I want you to feel what that must have been like. Once on shore, the goal is to get to Berlin. And this scene that I have here, it's called Bocage. It's a vining, very viney, thick trees and brush that is virtually impossible to get through, even with American tanks. We had to improvise and put blades on the front of the tanks just to get them through. The intelligence of what kind of land that was missing. We didn't have very good intelligence. So it took a while. And our goal, of course, is to get all the way to Berlin. This is 1940. This is June of 1944. Here is a picture of the cemetery at Normandy. The invasion was about 25,000 men, and the cemetery there contains about 10,000 bodies, not all of which were killed that day in the invasion. We lost about, as I recall, we lost about 2,500 in the invasion itself, most of whom were buried in mass graves by the French villagers that lived around there. And then in the early 1950s, we went back in and excavated those mass graves, did the best job we could of identifications, which was not DNA like it is today, but we used with dog tags and with uniforms and stuff. We were able to identify a lot of the men. And if any of you have been to Normandy, or if any of you have been to the cemetery at Normandy, it's quite an impressive thing to see. So from June of 1944 to April and May of 1945, that period is the period of a lot of battles. America and its allies have arrived in Europe, which is what President Stalin of Russia was hoping for, because that would relieve what was happening to him with the Germans on the Eastern Front, so to speak. And that is sort of where Europe is. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of battles take place, Battle of the Bulge, a lot of things. I'm not going to go into detail about any of those things. We just don't have time to do that. But if you want to study World War II, you will see that the invasion at Normandy is so very important for the Allies' ability to eventually get to Berlin and take down this terrible man, Adolf Hitler. So let me jump a little bit ahead here. Let me first talk about April 17th. 1945. The President of the United States dies at Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage. So America no longer has a leader that had been our leader during the war. So we've got FDR dead. Just 2 weeks later, this man, Adolf Hitler, and his new bride, who he marries that day, Eva Braun, are dead. How did that happen? Well, Adolf Hitler was a little bit of a drama queen anyway, but he knows that it's time for him to leave the leadership of the Nazi Party. He decides to do it by suicide. He takes Eva Braun, who he married that evening, takes her and his dog into the bunker. And they have poison, cyanide, I believe. And so they test the cyanide by giving it to the dog. And if it works, of course, the dog dies. And then he gives the cyanide, the poison to Eva Braun, and she dies. And then Hitler probably, we think, puts a bullet in his head. I always like to kind of tell this story. And here's a picture of the bunker, because right outside of Berlin at this time, right outside of Berlin is the Soviet army. And the Germans have been so tough on the Soviet army that the Soviet army wants to annihilate all of the people of Berlin, all of the people of Germany. They want revenge big time. And so in the final will of Adolf Hitler, he tells his men that as soon as I'm dead, I want you to take diesel fuel and pour that diesel fuel all over my body and burn me so that I cannot be identified. Well, these German soldiers that are reading the Hitler will, that know that he needs to be destroyed, or he needs to have his body destroyed, they sort of say, well, what the hell? I don't want to waste this diesel fuel on Hitler's body. I'm going to put this diesel fuel in the Jeep and get the hell out of here. And so they don't do a very good job of destroying Hitler's body. It's pretty evident that he is dead, but I mention this story because for the next many years, for the next at least 30 years, there will be these rumors, these conspiracy theories that Hitler survived and he's living down in South America somewhere, and there's always Hitler sightings until he's old enough to have been dead by natural causes. We're going to continue to hear about the survival of Adolf Hitler. Well, folks, it doesn't happen. He was killed in that bunker, probably took his own life. So we have a new president of the United States. His name is Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman was the third, who had been the fourth vice president under Roosevelt. Remember, Roosevelt's only been in office for his fourth term for a few weeks. So Harry Truman is a complete unknown guy. Been in World War I. He was an artillery officer in World War I. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, hardly even knows the guy, because I think they had lunch together every week, maybe, but they'd only been in office for a couple of weeks before he dies, Roosevelt dies. So Harry Truman doesn't really know much about what's going on, other than he was a senator in the United States Senate, and he knew what was going on that was told to him. But in terms of his role as vice president of the United States, he doesn't know much about what's going on. So on the day that he is sworn into office, which is Roosevelt dies in the morning, and then that afternoon, phone call comes in that the president of the United States is dead, and Mr. Truman, Vice President Truman, you are now the president. They swear him into office. And at that moment, the Secretary of War, a man by the name of Henry Stimson, comes into the office of the president, the new president of the United States. And he says, Mr. President, I have something very important to tell you. You know about the war is being won very successfully in Europe. You also know that we think within a few weeks we will be successful. Well, it was within a few weeks. 2 weeks later is when Hitler commits suicide. But this is April 17th, so it's 2 weeks before Hitler's dead. But they say to Harry Truman, Mr. President, we want you to know something that you probably have never been told, and that is over in a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico. And as you all know, that's only 6 hours from Lubbock. We are building a bomb. And it's a bomb that's so powerful that we believe it can end this war. And the people that have built it had planned on it being, the scientists that are building it had planned on it being used against Hitler in Europe. But we now know that it's not going to be necessary to use it against Hitler because Hitler is going to be, is on his way out. It's not yet dead, but he's on his way out. And these scientists that are building this bomb, many of them are Jewish immigrants. And so from their perspective, it was to be used against this terrible man, Hitler, but we wanted you to know about this bomb. And Harry says, well, where are we going to use it? And they said, we haven't decided. That's going to be your decision soon. So Harry Truman, now imagine this, that the vice president of the United States, who's now the president, doesn't know about an operation that's taking place out in Los Alamos, an operation called the Manhattan Project. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. But let's go to the Pacific Theater. In the Pacific, we finally have some airplanes that are capable of flying all the way from these islands all the way to Japan and dropping bombs. But we need more islands. We need more islands to have these B-29s be serviceable to get to what is going to be an invasion of Japan. Now, what you also need to know is that the military leaders that are fighting, the American military leaders and our allies, they don't know anything about this nuclear bomb being built in Los Alamos, New Mexico. They are planning an operation. It's called Operation Olympic. And it is an operation for the invasion by land, by sea, by air of Japan and the islands of Japan. That's being planned. And the Japanese have demonstrated very significantly that they will fight to the end. They're not going to give in. One of those battles, those big battles, takes place at a place called Iwo Jima, near Japan. Now, all of the battles that have taken place in this island hopping campaign that I talked about, all of these islands are pretty much occupied by the Japanese until the American Marines and British and the Army and everybody, until they come in and invade that island, losing many, many thousands of men in the process. In that operation, all of these men are confronting Japanese soldiers that fight to the death. But none of those islands are owned by Japan. They're occupied by Japan, but the people that live there are not Japanese. They happen to be from Guam or Saipan. They're not Japanese people. They just happen to be occupied by Japan. But there's a couple of key islands that are owned by Japan, meaning the people on the island are Japanese. And one of those islands is called Iwo Jima. And one of those islands is called Okinawa. You've heard about Iwo Jima. It's a very mountainous island. And it's a mountainous island where the Japanese have infiltrated the mountains and have set up caves. And the plan is for the Allies to invade Iwo Jima and fight their way up to the mountainous hideouts of the Japanese. It will be one of the worst battles for the American Marines in the entire war. And it will take about 2 weeks, but it's a huge battle. And there are very few Japanese prisoners taken alive, because they in some cases will commit suicide with hand grenades. Pull the pin, hold it next to your chest, and kill yourself. We see this happening all through Iwo Jima. But the idea is to set Iwo Jima up, build an airport, and be able to put our big B-29 planes on there to fly sorties into the Japanese cities like Tokyo, bomb the hell out of them, and then return for more armaments. That's the plan with these big super fortress planes. Let me see. I might even have a picture of one of those guys. Let me see if I've got a picture. Yeah, here we go. B-29 Super Fortress. Huge planes compared to what we had in the previously with our B-24s and B-25s that I talked about Tuesday. So the B-29 is a big plane, and it's a very important plane. So that's Iwo Jima. The United States will successfully take over Iwo Jima. Some historians argue that it wasn't all that necessary, but because we lost thousands of Marines in the process. Then there's another battle that takes place in an island called Okinawa. The battle at Okinawa should have taken maybe 2 to 3 weeks. However, it takes a couple of months. This is important to know how long it took, because what happens is those Japanese citizens of Okinawa are told by the Japanese leaders that you should commit suicide before you allow an American soldier to capture you, rape you if you are a woman or a child, and then they will kill you. That's what American soldiers do. So we see thousands of Japanese women climb to the top of cliffs carrying their small babies and jumping off of cliffs. Now, the reason this is important to understand is because all of this is going on while this new president of the United States is the commander-in-chief. He's watching it happen, and he's seeing the dedication of Japanese soldiers to the fight. He's also seeing the dedication of Emperor Hirohito and his military leaders to make sure that they fight to the end for the emperor. And it concerns Truman to the point where it's going to become very much a part of the decision that's going to take place about what to do to end this war. Now, these B-29 super fortresses are going to be used to firebomb Tokyo. Now, I mentioned the other day that Tokyo has a lot of wooden buildings. And if you can drop incendiary bombs that produce fire on downtown Tokyo, you can not only kill a lot of people, but you can burn a lot of city. Tokyo is, of course, the capital of Japan, and the emperor himself lives there. So we see thousands and thousands of sorties. Sortie is just a mission to drop bombs on Tokyo. And we'll see these bombs being dropped. Here's one picture of the air bombing of Tokyo. And here's the aftermath of that bombing. but we're getting closer. Here is Japan, okay? Here is Japan, and the plan that the military is planning right now is an invasion on the ground into Japan, the main island of Japan, under Operation Olympic. The expectation that's being presented to President Truman is the invasion of Japan to end this war will probably cost the lives. Some of the numbers are so high, they're saying it will cost the lives of several 100,000 Americans. By this time, probably 400,000 Americans are dead. And so in the fighting in Europe and the fighting in the Pacific. But what's being told to the president is this invasion, by the way that the Japanese have fought at Iwo Jima, well, in all the islands, but most recently at Iwo Jima and at Okinawa, indicates to us that there may be as many as 500,000 people die, Americans being many of them, but also many Japanese will die as a result of this invasion under Operation Olympic. That's the word that is coming down to the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States. Now, with that, I'm going to end this lecture and finish the war on Tuesday with the ending, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I am instead going to open it up to questions today.
I do have a question.
Where?
What was the one operation called for the D-Day at Normandy?
Well, you know what?
Operation Overlord.
I didn't mention it. It's called Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord. I had it on the slide, but it's called Operation Overlord, and it is what generally is called D-Day. But it is Operation Overlord, and it was scheduled for the day before on June 5th. But what happens is there is the weather, our forecasters, our meteorologists weren't as good then as they are now. And so what you had then was, we think it's a good time, but we had to, the problem was being able to not only do the landing with all these ships coming across the English Channel, but you also had the ability to get the airborne troops in from the air. And so the links that I'm going to give you will show you both the air operation of the men jumping in with the 101st Airborne Division, and also you'll be able to see the Marines coming on shore with the scenes from the battle from Saving Private Ryan. So Saving Private Ryan is the Marines landing, and the one that I'll be showing you of the jump into Normandy will be from a television movie a few years ago on HBO called Band of Brothers. And I'm going to give you those two links. There are probably 10 to 15 minutes each. Make sure you watch them because you may be examined on them. They're very important, okay? What else?
I have one.
Aubrey.
What did you say the date for the date whenever FDR died?
He died on April 17th. He died on April 17th of 1945. And he had just been inaugurated into his, that was back when we inaugurated in March. So he had just been inaugurated for his fourth term, 32, 36, 40. So he's been reelected in 1944. And then in November, but his inauguration for his fourth term, which would be important because that's when Harry Truman becomes his vice president, his death is April 17th. But his inauguration is March 4th. So from March 4th to April 17th is the only amount of time that Franklin Roosevelt had with his new vice president, Harry Truman, the new commander-in-chief on April 17th. What else can I answer?
Yes, sir. I had a quick question.
Taylor.
So, President Truman was an artillery what in World War I?
He was an artillery captain, an artillery commander, we usually call him. We actually call him battery commander. in World War I. And in World War I, you were elected. He was in the Missouri National Guard. You get elected to your leadership roles in World War I. So his people liked him, but he was a combat soldier. So he did, and that's important to know, because now this combat soldier that's now the commander in chief is going to have a bunch of decisions to make that are going to influence the life and death of not only thousands of people, but also the survival of his country in this war.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Anyone else?
Yes, I have one.
Let me see who I've got. First, I've got Byron and then Emily. Byron?
Okay, how many missions did the Tuskegee Airmen do?
Well, the number I think I gave you was 15,000.
15,000.
Yeah, it's a bunch. And the significance of what they did is that they were running, they were flying missions where they are fighter pilots protecting bombing pilots, because these aircraft, bombing aircraft are big and heavy, and they carry a lot of armament, but they also just carry a couple of guys with machine guns, and they're not really fighting vehicles. So you have them escorted by fighter aircraft that are faster and have more armament on them and are more maneuverable. So you're escorting them into the onto the enemy area where they're going to drop their bombs. They did a hell of a job.
Okay, thank you. And what month was D-Day, did you say?
June 6,
June.
1944.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And I'll say this, you know, because y'all are interested in things like examinations. As I told you one day, I'm not a big date guy. In other words, if you put a date down and it's not right, I'm not going to get upset about it. But what I do want you to understand is the sequence of events that I've been talking about for these last 3 lectures. In other words, when do these things happen in relationship to other things happening? So you should know that, you know, the victory over Europe takes place before the victory over Japan. You should know that D-Day takes place before the victory in Europe. You know, those kinds of things are important to understand. How they relate to each other is more important than the actual day of the week or the day of the month, or even in some cases, the day of the year. So understand the relationships. That's important.
Thank you.
Yep. Let's see, Emily, you had a question.
Yes, can you please go over Dory Miller one more time?
Yeah, Dory Miller was well, first of all, he was a black sailor. And actually, I'll give you more information than you probably asked for. He's from Waco, Texas. And he had joined the Navy. And as the way black sailors or black soldiers were treated, they gave them the jobs that were least, they were considered important to the ranking people, but they were not combat jobs. And so Dory Miller was given the job of being an admiral's aide. He was the one that made sure that the admiral's hat was on straight, that his breakfast waffles were placed in the right place in the admiral's dining room, stuff like that. And when Pearl Harbor happened, the ship was ready to sink and the admiral was killed and he was his aide. So Dory Miller became a fighting sailor. Even though he'd never been trained to, he went up on top of the ship and manned a 50 caliber machine gun and started shooting down Japanese airplanes that were attacking the ship. Now the ship eventually sunk. Now, sadly, Dory Miller, after this event, he was transferred to another ship. He was recognized for his service, but he was also still black. And so the attitude about black soldiers in those days, or black sailors, was, well, let's give them a job, they'll do it well, but we're not going to give them anything important to do. So he was made a cook. And sadly, he was killed in 1943 in the Pacific on one of the ships that was that was sunk, he was killed. So the legacy of Dory Miller is that he is one of the most important and bravest sailors of World War II. And they have now, like I say, they're naming an aircraft carrier after this very low ranking black sailor from Waco, Texas. That's kind of cool.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Aaron.
Yeah, it's kind of a tangent. So after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, moral and like ethical reasons why aside, why didn't the United States just kind of go for like extend into Russia or just kind of, you know, keep going? Why did they stop after the Axis powers were eliminated if they possessed a technology that was so devastating that at that time no one else possessed? Because I believe, could be wrong about this, but I think General Patton was one of the advocates to just keep going, I guess, in that regard.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I would rather hold off on answering that until we've bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima and we sort of set up the Cold War. Okay, because I think it's important that all the, I mean, obviously you're somebody that knows this history, but not everybody that's taken the class does, and they might appreciate the answer after we finish the war and when we start the Cold War, which will be the first lecture I'll be giving after your next exam. But it's a very good question, and it's important. Who else?
I have one.
Emily.
In regards to the Tuskegee Airmen, how many German aircraft did they shoot down?
The records that I show was about 112 is a pretty good number, and that's the number that they actually shot down in that 15,000 sorties. What's equally important is how many American bombers didn't get shot down, that they protected, and that would be virtually every one of them flying those sorties. Let me see if I even have that. Oh, well, here's what I have. Of those 15,000 sorties, only 25 American bombers were ever shot down. 25 out of 15,000 sorties. Now, that's the same plane many, many times, of course, but that does give you some evidence that they did a good job. And sadly, you know, talk about bad stuff happening. This is also during that period of time when the American military apparatus, under the leadership probably of FDR before and maybe even Harry Truman after, are doing those experiments with venereal disease infecting airmen down in Tuskegee. It's terrible. Here's another interesting thing, I think, is that the reason that the Tuskegee Airmen were developed is because that first quote that I gave you that said that the fear of putting having African-American pilots in the Army Air Corps is that all those enlisted men that are going to be the mechanics, that are going to be the fighter machine gunners and things, are going to be white. And we can't have black pilots supervising white men. And so the idea was, well, let's create a whole unit and we'll have the mechanics be black, we'll have the machine gunners be black, the pilots will be black, but that's okay because they're all black. That was the mentality that's going on in the US military during World War II. Now, I will be talking about this when I talk about Korea in a couple of weeks, and then I will expand on this discussion when I talk about Vietnam. Because one of the things that Harry Truman does that I argue is one of the great profiles in courage among American presidents is integrating the military. And they integrate the military before American society ever integrates itself. And I'll be talking about that over the next few weeks. Good question. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, listen, I hope you all have a good weekend. If you have opportunities to get vaccinated, do it. I know you're not of the right age, but I understand that the Civic Center is sometimes allows volunteers that do not fit into 1A and 1B. If you have comorbidities, you're eligible, but I encourage all of you to get vaccinated so we can get this university up running like it should be. I just got an email from President Skovanec. I don't know if you guys got it too, but I just got an email from him saying that our plan is now to go to 100% face-to-face this fall, which means that all these classes you're going to be registering for in a few weeks. Right now we're at 50%, but next week we're going to go, for the registration, we're in the process of putting all the rooms back to 100% for the fall. So I encourage you to do that. Somebody else asked me, and I'll just mention this while I've got a few of them on here. Somebody asked me about the summer classes, and I am teaching 2 classes in summer 1, both online. One of them is called The History of Small Wars, which is a 4,000 level course. And we talk about operations that are not like World War I and World War II, but more like operations in Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan, stuff like that. And then I'm also teaching a course called Film and Society, and it's about film, and the subtitle of that class is called War Cinema, in which case you will watch over 5 weeks, you'll watch probably 10 films on your own time. And then we will have a class discussion synchronously about what you learned from those films. I usually teach it every summer about Vietnam, but this year I'm teaching it and it'll be on World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, maybe even Iraq and Afghanistan, don't know yet. But my point is that this is it's a very good class and we enjoy the discussion. So that's a 3,000 level course if you need another history course. So that be it. Anything else? Okay, y'all have a great weekend, and I will see you. We'll do Tuesday as a review session, and you're not required to come to review sessions, although most of you are still on, do come to review sessions, and that's a good thing. And I will be on with my TAs, and we will talk about processes. We'll talk a little bit about the exam and the way it went and stuff like that. So some of you, if you made mistakes first time, you don't make those same mistakes second time, that kind of stuff. We'll also talk about, I will end this war by talking about the nuclear dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then we'll do a review session. I'll be on for a few minutes and then I'll probably turn it over to my TAs. And then on Thursday, a week from today, you will take the second exam, okay? Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah, Aaron.
I was looking at your syllabus and it says you have office hours at 5 to 6 today.
Yeah.
Okay, and the best way, is there like a link on the Blackboard website to access?
No, the best way to get in touch with me for any meeting, I do office hours. I won't say it's exactly 24/7, but almost. And by that, I mean, I will meet with you by Zoom at your convenience and my convenience. We set it up. It doesn't make any difference whether it's from 5 to 6. I just had to put something on the syllabus. I'm always willing to talk to students individually, and I've already done that with some of you. So all you got to do is send me an email and tell me some times that work for you, some days and times that work for you, and we'll find a time even if it's at night.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? All right. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you all next Tuesday. See you.
Thank you.